Chapter 3. Kryn awoke in the morning, earlier than he usually would. Most days he would scramble and rush out the door, barely having time to eat anything just to make it to the factory for his shift. Today, however, was a different day. The previous night he had been promoted to a foreman, thanks to the ore of Arcanveil that he and Aiden found. This meant more responsibility, timeliness, and most importantly, arcs. It was an opportunity he did not want to ruin due to his normal habits. He bathed himself the previous night, as he didn't want his first day in a new uniform to be tainted by days-old soot and debris. However, despite his new attire and feeling refreshed, he did have a feeling of guilt. It was Aiden who actually found the ore of Arcanveil. It just happened to be that Kryn was also there with him and helped him dig it out. He was in the right place at the right time, but due to Aiden's decision to not take the promotion offered, it was only Kryn who would gain the benefits of Aiden's discovery. Kryn closed the door to his maisonette and locked it behind him. He lived in the second story of this building. It wasn't in the best of shape. The walls were thin enough to hear everything happening, while the floorboards creaked under each step, and the stairs that led to the base floor always felt like they would give out at any moment. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. Maybe a home he could move from with his extra arcs he would earn over time. Well, Aiden should be surprised to see me all cleaned up, Kryn said to himself. Maybe I'll tell him that's my goodbye present. Finally bathing so he can't complain about my odor while working. Kryn chuckled a bit as he continued to walk and talk to himself. It was a bit awkward walking to the factory this early. Normally, by now, he'd have met up with some of the other workers and chatted with them along the way. But needing to be an hour early to the factory changed that. Kryn continued his walk to the factory. It was a bit farther than Aiden's walk was. He lived in a more put-together area of the city than his friend, but not by much. He strolled through the market district, waving at the shopkeepers opening for the day, and saw the same group of children walking to Torleth Academy. They wore their usual cerulean gold uniforms, while being escorted by an officer. Eventually, he passed a few smaller residential areas, leading him into the industrial district where the factory awaited him. It was odd, honestly. Normally, there had been a small wave of people walking their way into the factory at this time in the morning. But now he was alone. The stone bridge that crossed over the city canals looked so much bigger without the crowd of people marching through. He made his way about halfway across the bridge and looked over the side of the canals below. They flowed through the eastern side of the city, eventually bending before Alaric Palace, the home of Lady Juliana herself, then wrapped through the western side of Torleth. At one time, the canals and the buildings at their waterfronts were almost always active. City folk would always travel the canals by boat to visit various shops and restaurants that Torleth had to offer. However, they had not been used in some time, since before Kryn was even born. Now the buildings appeared run down, the water murky and dirtied from the pollution of the factory, and quite honestly, lifeless. It was sad to think of what the city used to be before the rise of Lady Juliana. Kryn took a deep breath and continued walking to the factory to begin his new career as a foreman. He wasn't exactly sure what all duties the job would require, as Kellett was somewhat vague. Just that he would be in charge down in the mines, making sure that things went as planned. As he pushed open the steel doors, he saw the prisoners working as well as they could at the different stations, most of which were similar to those he had seen in the mines, tired, malnourished, and emotionally defeated. He noticed Kellett walking amongst the floor in the direction of his office, passing a welding station. He was wiping his hands off with a cloth of sorts that seemed to be stained red. Kryn looked from where he came from and saw a prisoner on the ground, blood coming from his face with metal scraps scattered around next to a now half-emptied box. He must have done something to upset Kellett to trigger his short temper. More disturbing, however, is that the officers just left him there as they walked away with Kellett, and the prisoners that had been working seemed to not even notice or react to what had happened. They had been far too used to this happening. Kryn did his best to mind his own business and made his way to the lift towards the mines. Kellett did notice him and gave him a small nod approving of Kryn being on time and ready to work. He entered the lift, pulled the lever, and made his way down to the bottom of the mines. The trip down was also awkward and silent. Nobody to talk to, just the sounds of gears turning and above engines roaring. It would take Kryn getting some used to this, but thankfully Aiden and his fellow workers would be there within the hour. As he arrived at the bottom, he approached some of the officers on duty to get a status update on progress made and any specific goals for the day. They looked at him and simply scoffed with a laugh, then walked away. They didn't take him seriously, and they probably wouldn't for a while. As he looked around, he didn't see much more progress that was made through the night. The prisoners worked much slower than the paid workers. He knew this was the case, but wasn't aware just how much slower they had actually worked until he physically saw it. It was no wonder that there had been so many prisoner deaths, as they were forced to work until they had quite literally nothing left. However, while there had not been much progress made, he did notice one thing. The ore of Arcanveil had been fully removed and was gone. Some time went by, and the shift change would happen soon. He heard the sound of the lift begin to roar, signaling the change in time. It was really the only way one could get a sense of time to know when their shift was actually over. The prisoners put down their tools and equipment and dragged their way to the lift. As the doors opened, the crew that was inside began to swap their places with the prisoners. Something wasn't right. Kryn looked at each person entering the mine. They walked in, grabbing tools and equipment left for them by the prisoners to get their day started, but he didn't recognize any of them. None of these workers were the same as the previous day. They were people he recognized. However, these workers were ones he would normally pass doing different jobs in the factory. They weren't his crew he had been working with. But more concerning, Aiden was not among them either. Aiden awoke in the morning from what little sleep he was able to get. It was more likely that the panic that had set in caused him to pass out from mental fatigue, rather than normal exhaustion. His cell was smaller than his room at home, and the bedroll was even more uncomfortable. The stone floors were cold, and there were no windows to let in any kind of light into the cell. The only light that he saw was when the officers lit lanterns through the cell block to gather any of the prisoners and captives. This wasn't even the Torleth prison. It was just the holding cells in the feudal district. If these are just temporary cells, Aiden thought, then I can't imagine what the conditions were like at the actual prison. He had spent most of the night trying to think of ways he could come out on top during his trial today. There had been something he could say that would surely prove his innocence. Something he could do, say, or even lie about. Maybe I can tell them that I was actually going to take the position Kellett's offered me, and that I had changed my mind. It would mean I would actually have to take the job, but it could get me out of being a prisoner. Aiden's continued thinking from the previous night was quickly cut off, as he saw a dim light slowly coming towards his cell from down the hall. "You're up, Carathal," said an officer who approached him with the lantern. "Justisar Himmler will see your case now." The officer then opened the cell, directing Aiden to exit. He was still wearing the same manacles from the night before. They had cut into his hands, causing some light bleeding, and his head still radiated some pain from the officer that had struck him. Aiden walked out with compliance. He walked down the hall, counting about 30 or so cells in the building, most of which were empty. Aiden had been at the farthest end, and was the last to have his trial for the morning. Mentally, physically, and emotionally defeated, he wasn't sure how he was even able to stand, let alone walk. However, he continued to walk forward. He was led through another door at the end of the cell block. The officer opened the door, and a blinding light shone through, causing pain in his eyes. As his vision cleared, he saw that he was in the trial chambers. Justisar Himmler sat to his right behind a raised desk. He was an older, well-dressed man in a cerulean and gold noble suit. His hair was short, and he wore an eye patch over his right eye. "Take a seat," said Himmler, "amongst your conspirators." "My what?" asked Aiden. He then turned to see a set of tables in the center of the room facing Himmler's desk. They were pushed together to make one long table. Sitting in chairs with their manacles chained to the tables was a set of familiar faces. Dell? Pearlie? Nathan? And everyone else? They didn't just detain me. They detained all of us. Except Kryn. Aiden stood shocked. His co-workers from the previous few shifts had also been in the same situation as himself. He came to accept the fact that he was detained as a form of retaliation, but the other mine workers also suffering the same fate was something he did not expect, nor was he prepared for it. They all stared at him, not with anger, but more with concern and confusion. Aiden felt a shove from behind him as the officer pushed him forward to take his seat. He stumbled as he moved forward from the shove and sat down next to his associates. They all looked just as tired, confused, and defeated as he did. Most of them were still dirty from the previous shift, which made sense. If they had been detained in the same way Aiden had, then there wouldn't have been any time to clean up. The man Aiden sat next to looked at him. "Aiden," whispered Nathan, "do you know what's going on? What is happening?" "I'm not sure," Aiden replied. "But I think it has something to do with the Arcanveil that was found in the mines yesterday." "The Arcanveil?" said Nathan. "But that doesn't make any sense. I thought finding it was a good thing." "That's what I thought. But when I met Kellitz, he said that—" "Silence," said Himmler with a loud voice that echoed through the chamber. "There will be no more words that come from any of you, unless it is regarding questioning to come." The crew then fell silent. "You have all been detained under the belief and received information of conspiracy and treason," Himmler said. "The penalty, if found guilty, is 2 life sentences, 1 for each charge. What is the defense you wish to present to me?" The crew all looked up at each other, not knowing what to say. After a moment, one of the crew members spoke up. "We didn't do anything, Sir Himmler," said the crew member. "He's right," another said. "We don't even know what would have led to this." "Last night I was detained when I got home," Nathan said, "in front of my family. You can even ask them. I would never do anything like this." More of the crew members continued to chime into the conversation, claiming they had no idea what was happening, where this false information would even come from. And they were right. The information wasn't true at all. Aiden remained silent as the crew continued to argue with Himmler. They carried on about how this entire trial shouldn't even be happening, and it was unjust. However, Himmler continued to almost disregard anything they were saying. Aiden looked around, still silent, and noticed that this room was quite empty. Aside from the doors that led to the cells, another door behind them that led to what he assumed was outside, and the desk that Himmler sat behind, there was nothing else here. No rows for an audience, no stands for a jury. Aiden knew the fair trials that were held were simply a gimmick, but everything became more obvious now. Their fates had been decided before they even left the mines yesterday. This was simply a formality.